Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to get started. Welcome. I'm Lena. I'm here with Amy and Paul and Matt, and we're going to talk about memories that smell like gasoline. I'm going to read each of their bios, and then Amy is the editor of David, is going to talk about her relationship and read her intro that she did to the book. And then Paul and Matt, yeah, this is the incredible book. It was originally published there we go, yeah. And Nightboat did a reprint of it last year. And so after Amy, Paul, and Matt are both going to talk about their art and their relationship to David's work. So I'll read the bios. So Amy Scholder has produced 3 highly acclaimed featured films: Heightened Scrutiny, directed by Sam Feder; My Name is Andrea, which were premiered at the 2022 Tribeca Film Festival; Disclosure, also directed by Sam Feder, which premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival and was released by Netflix in 2020. Over the years, she has managed important imprints such as Feminist Press, High Risk Books, /Serpent Tail, Verso, and 7 Stories. She's the editor-at-large at City Lights Books, and she serves on the board of directors of One Institute, Nightboat Books, and City Lights Foundation. We love Amy. Paul Sepuya is an artist working in photography. He has a BFA from NYU and an MFA in photography from UCLA. Sepuya's work is in many permanent collections, including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, MoCA Los Angeles, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Guggenheim, and the Getty. And he is an associate professor of media arts and the MFA program director at the University of California, San Diego, and has taught at Cal Arts and Bard. Matt Lips has a BFA in photography from California State University, Long Beach, and an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. His work is in the permanent collection of the Getty, LACMA, SF MoMA, MoCA Los Angeles, and the Hammer Museum. Lips is represented by Mark Selwyn Fine Arts, Los Angeles, Yancey Richard Gallery, New York, and Josh Lilly Gallery, London. Matt lives and works in Los Angeles. Okay, without further ado, Amy Scholder.
Hello, everyone. Hello. I can hear that. Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Amy Scholder. I'm the editor of this book, Memories That Smell Like Gasoline by David Wojnarowicz. It's the 2nd edition of this book, and in my introduction, I talk about its history, so I thought I would just read some pages from that note. So when I was getting the first edition of Memories That Smell Like Gasoline ready for press in 1992, David was dying. It was our first and last book to prepare together. The other books by David that I published were posthumous. We decided to work on this one first because it felt so close to the reckonings we were having at the time, how memory has a smell and touch and feel, how it seems to change our DNA, how memorializing in words and pictures can find new meanings, keep something alive, maybe. I was living in San Francisco. My friend Rex Ray introduced me to Anne McDonald, a curator and art collector who wanted to publish an imprint of books featuring contemporary art and writing. She hired me to be the editor. Memories was our first book in the series. The second book featured drawings by Nayland Blake and writings by Dennis Cooper. A third were pictures by Nan Golden. David was living in a loft above the Village East movie theater on 2nd Avenue and 12th Street. It had been Peter Hujar's last apartment. Anita Vitale was there when the Post delivered the finished book of memories from the printer to David's address. She was the best friend of Tom Raffenbart, David's lover. He also had AIDS. David was bedridden by then. Anita opened the package and showed him the book. He wasn't speaking much at that point, but communicated with his eyes. as they went through the book together. When they got to the end, he wanted her to read aloud this part. I'm waving my hands. I am disappearing, but not fast enough. And then he said, ah, and closed his eyes. I was so relieved to hear that he got the book and got to see it, but I wonder, does a book really matter when you're at the end of a life cut short at the age of 37? Do you think, well, at least this will remain? I don't know how David really felt in that moment, but I do know that he loved books and wanted to be a published author since he was an adolescent, so maybe this book mattered to him. I've learned since then that it has mattered to many other people. Just 3 years after that summer when the book came out and David died, a treatment for HIV/AIDS hit the market. It would keep people who had access to it alive. Tom, who thought he was going to die soon after David, was on a clinical trial for this treatment in 1994. He lived to be 74 years old. A few years after another pandemic, on September 14th, 2024, I sat among a few hundred people in an AIDS memorial park in the West Village in New York to celebrate what would have been David's 70th birthday. It was a beautiful event created by Anita, now the executor of David's estate. I was joined by Nayland, performer John Kelly, Karen Rinaldi, the editor of Close to the Knives, and a long list of artists and writers, friends and fans of David's who read aloud from the Waterfront journals, which I had published in 1996. It was incredibly moving to hear these readings in a public square on this occasion. Afterwards, at dusk, a lot of us walked over to the Hudson River to yet another AIDS memorial. Unbeknownst to me, Anita had brought some of David's remains, he had been cremated, which Tom had never scattered. She thought it might be a good moment to let them go. In queer community, with so many people who love David. So she took out a few Ziploc bags from her purse. She had mixed in some of Tom too, she said. Why not? At first, I recoiled. It was hard to feel so emotional in front of all these people, many friends and acquaintances, but even more strangers. Soon, though, surrounded by young people who never knew David, I became overwhelmed with other feelings of their love for his work, for his legacy. It seemed to me that they wanted to experience this visceral, vertiginous act of touching him, of what remained of him, and to let the ashes go into the air, hopefully into the river, but of course the wind had different ideas. The first story in Memories, Into the Drift and Sway, is accompanied by watercolors that David made from memory after spending time at a porn theater. They form a diary of desire, of memory and the ways we keep pleasure alive by imagining it. That practice of David's inspires me to do this work year after year. I'm so grateful to Stephen and Lindsay and Lena at Nightboat Books, and I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming, and especially to Matt and Paul. I so appreciate you being with me today.
It's on. I guess I'll just read a section. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Let's see. Okay. Let's get real close. Okay. We're going to read something. It's a little dirty, which is great. So this is begins on page 3 in the book. Into the Drift and Sway. Should I also describe why I chose this section? I mean, it's been interesting to read this. I think about perhaps this process of making photographs, and maybe we can get into, being photographers. I'm really interested in this idea of writing, or as describing the watercolors being made from memory in these porn theaters. And I very much don't have a process of working from memory or thinking through memory and images. I think sometimes the production of images gets in the way of that. But in a way, I know David's work through images. And so there's this relationship to the kind of images that are created as he revisits these memories that I found particularly interesting. And so that's why I chose, there's a part that probably stands out. You'll know it when we get to it. Okay. Into the drift and sway, and we can talk more about this later. Okay. Sometimes it gets dark in here behind these eyes. I feel like a physical equivalent of a scream. The highway at night in the headlights of this speeding car, speeding is the only motion that lets the heart unravel. And in the wind of the road, the two-story framed houses appear one after the other like some cinematic stage set. Houses on both sides of my face unraveling towards me, and the trees casting shadows like fallen x-rays into the sides of the white clapboard, and occasionally some yard dog hooting a silent fear noise. It's lost in the rush of everything. And once before, when I felt this way, I screamed loud and long and hated the sound of my own voice, and so I haven't ever tried it again. I hate highways, but love speeding, and I can only think of men's bodies and the drift and the sway of my own. If sex was a dance, I'd do a crawl for that body I saw this afternoon in the guy stepping out of the cab of his truck in the parking lot of the bus stop. He looked kind of Canadian and kind of sexy, collared shirt and tight faded jeans and thick leather belt and boots and a crease in the front of his pants that let his dick rest lazy and calm, and forearms I'd want under my tongue and under my tongue. And after the turn on the bridge, when I'd swung back going north, stopped at a rest stop, and a truck pulled in, and I walked past it a little later, and a ruby red light flickered on, and a silhouette of a man in worker's pants stepped out swinging from the bar next to the outside rear view mirror, and walked past me in a blaze of car light and entered the bathroom. I walked around for a while. He never came back out. Finally, I went in and bent slightly, saw his legs beneath the frame of one of the stalls, and took one next to him, pulled down my pants, and sat on the cold toilet and looked down to my side, and there was a puddle of water between the two stalls under the dividing panel, and it reflected light from the overhead ceiling fixtures, and through its transparency was the squared outline of gray floor tiles. And as I looked at it, I realized that I could see the overhead lit features of this truck driver and the pale wash of his eyes and jawline and cheekbones, and following the illuminated shoulders, sorry, we got some porny images in between, the surface of the puddle down his arms. Only one was illuminated, and part of his chest pressing through the flimsy t-shirt and down his forearms and to his wrists, and the puddle moved a bit, breaking the image into wavy lines and pieces of light, and that's when his face came back in focus, and the water was still. I held my breath so as to not disturb it. I looked in the vicinity of his hands, two hands lit from various angles, pieces of fingers with cold white lights, and parts of wrists, and all of it wrapped around a silhouette of a hard dick, which he waved back and forth in the reflection. His image, for a moment, looked like it was floating upside down beneath the surface of the floor, and I was therefore floating right side up. And from his vantage point, I was floating upside down. And he right side up, and in the cab of his rig, he pulled off his pants, saying, "Don't worry about the cops. They always check the cars first, and by flashing their flashlights through each one, we got plenty of time just to enjoy it. Go ahead, enjoy yourself," and putting his big hands around the back of my neck and pressing gently till my face could make out the outline of his moving dick. I could see the dim hairs covering his balls. "Go ahead, use your tongue a lot, and less teeth. That's more tongue, and less teeth, yeah. Where I come from, there's 3 brothers who come over to my place. When they can get away, they come over for the night, and they love it. Go ahead, that's right, enjoy it yourself." His fingers and face scattered into shards of light.
I have a presentation that I'm going to show, actually, but let's see. this and this. Okay. No, I've actually transcribed it. At the invitation, I want to thank everybody also for this opportunity, and at the invitation to share a little bit of like a connection as an artist, as a visual like maker of images and photography, and thinking about how much David Wojnarowicz has inspired my work. I was thinking like, I know for sure there are elements, like I could think of some collages and stuff, and this was like, I learned about his work at CSULB. Thankfully, it was like, we had a large queer community there. We had some art historians there that were really up on things and sharing work that they knew the students wanted to see, and I was really appreciative that I was exposed very early on, and I found out that while I'm a photographer that works in appropriation, I'm winging it for you, that's kind of like filling up space. I had been working in appropriation by way of like stealing from David Wojnarowicz far more than I imagined. So I'm going to share with you a bunch of embarrassing pictures from very, very early baby work of mine. But I'm going to read a section of from the book first. And while I'm reading it, I'm going to be showing you my MFA thesis exhibition from 2004. And the reason being is the section that I'm going to pull from is actually David is in the midst of like a hookup. He's cruising some guy. He catches a glance and they have an exchange and it goes from there. And while I think we got it. Okay. And while this notion of like of cruising and promiscuity and sexual partners, while I've never had that, having been safe sex educated in 1990, I was 15 years old, and it was pretty much the peak of deaths from AIDS. Yes, that is great. And I let's see. Is it? Did you download it? Sorry. It should be opening, if we can download that file. And sorry, I thought we had this all worked out. If you go to the App Store and you can I was going to flick through the pictures while I was reading it, was the idea, but okay, let's try that. Sorry about that. I was cruising magazines and books and having relationships with pictures, basically, is the idea. And so, so in my MFA thesis work, which I was going to show, there is, it is when I finally get the text, Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida text in my hand that talks about this notion tethering photography to death, that every image, once the shutter has clicked, the image belongs to death a certain kind of way. And I was thinking about the kind of, like, a legacy that we had inherited, like, as a young gay man, again, safe sex educated in the 1990s, where, any kind of sex equal disease, but gay sex specifically equal death. And so the idea that, I was looking at the pictures that I was looking at while I was excited about this idea of pre-condom gay porn, that it was actually pre-AIDS porn. And they didn't say that. They were saying pre-condom but not pre-AIDS, and it was when I had realized that part where I was just like, these pictures that I'm looking at, these men, because of their sex practices, they may or may not they may or may not be living anymore. And so I was excited by pictures, but I was also haunted by the specter of death that was not only a Bartesian sort of death, this idea that the photograph belongs to history a certain kind of way, but because these men might actually be gone. And so it was this sort of tension that I was feeling, not only as a person in the world, feeling very tense in my body in relationship to other bodies, but also a tension with this idea that I was being titillated by these kinds of pictures that I felt were surrogates for actual lovers. And if we can't do the presentation, I could just read the section and we can have a conversation too. It's no big deal. That's okay. So close. Hey. Yeah, and that's also fine. Yeah. So in that case, we can return to the table. All right. So you'll have to imagine a bunch of dirty pictures flashing behind me that I made in 2004. And here we go. I think it's around page 38. He uttered a series of squeaks and grunts and flashed me a smile. Something clicked in my head. I mean, he was intense and oddly sexy with a muscular body covered in scrapes and a few bruises. He looked like he walked out of some waterfront in an old queer French novel. He managed to order a burger to go, and as the counterman went in the back to place the order, he leaned over the counter and lifted the plastic lid of a Danish case and slipped one inside his filthy shirt. He winked at me as he speared the second Danish and dropped it down his neckline. Then he walked over and extended his hand, and I shook it. Something was clicking somewhere. When I shook his hand, and he made an odd little gesture with his middle finger against my palm and winked again. There was an air of desperation and possible violence around him like a rank perfume, and that was what suddenly became sexy to me. I tried to understand this sensation, why the remote edge of violence attracts me to a guy. I associate with certain gestures or body language or scars or other physical characteristics an entire flood of memories and fictions and mythologies. It's something in the blue ink tattoos or coal-scratched rubbings made in prison cells or in delinquent basement parties. Maybe it's the sense that he could easily and dispassionately murder someone, or rob a liquor store, or a small roadside gas station, or bang some salesman in the head at a highway rest stop and steal his automobile. It's something about the sense of violence carried as a distancing tool to break down the organized world. And the weird freedom in his failure to recognize the manufactured codes of rules. The violence that floats like static electricity that completely annihilates the possibility of future or security. I'm attracted to living like that, moment to moment, with very little piling up of information, breaking the windows of cause and response. Beyond all this, it's also what happens when violence hangs above the road to a sexual act that gets subverted within the series of small kissing motions at the base of my dick or across the underside of my balls. The sweetness of sad lips of that criminal face lowering itself around my dick and the quiet sucking motion that I guide him into. It's not just that violence fades into sweetness. It's looking at the flesh of the body and recognizing that it's a restraint that keeps the blood inside the form, that the blood of the body creates a pressure so that it would spray out in every direction if it were not for the skin holding it back. It's sensing the history of that body and the temporariness of it all. I understand that his body and mind have no understanding of the prescriptions of this society's values, that time is lost to him, except for progressions of gestures that attempt to satiate hungers of various sorts. When I engage with a guy like this, I'm laying open a trust, illusory or otherwise, that can strip open all the body's desires, and for a very brief moment of living, we let ourselves get lost. Yeah. So, and thanks. and like my attraction to that part of the essay is him going through these types of like bad object choices, and that sort of that spirit of like looking at pictures and sort of cruising art history and cruising through magazines, which was for me the safest sex I could participate in, and that I felt comfortable like occupying. So that was what that was about.
Yeah, this one is on. Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. When did you first encounter his work? What age were you? Because I'm curious about this. Like something that I'm thinking about is, you know, in the book, he's returning to these memories, these like very intense memories of sexuality, exploitation, and everything, right? But there's so much, I think, what you're talking about, and I think about of like these adolescent moments of image cruising, of anticipating images, of like the way images sort of like key us into this world that is out there, but it's both exciting and dangerous. And then as photographers producing, you know, this idea of producing images, I'm curious like when you encountered his work, like what year was that? And
it was probably about 1994 or 5, and I was still like shockingly thinking that I was in the closet, even though I was by all legibility, open eyes, obviously gay. But I was making straight photographs. I was definitely like, I was like Ansel Adams style photography. And I remember at Long Beach State, not only did we have I had an amazing art history professor named Karen Kleinfelder, who was like really up on showing us to broad range of imagery, but also it was Todd Gray's first year, was my last year it was not until my last year, yeah, so that was like actually 96, 97. And he was like, I can see you can make a really good photograph, but I wonder if you have anything to say. And I was like, I was like, I'm gonna come out through photography. And I'd already seen Wojnarowicz's work in printmaking classes, in painting classes, and it was those little portholes of pornography, like those little circles, that really allowed me to sit with his paintings and pay attention the way I wanted to the parts I wanted to. I was like, oh, I really like this art history class. It's really interesting. And so like seeing that sort of collage making and thinking about portals and how all of these photographs were existing within this really complex array that sort of got me into thinking about not only appropriation, because he was also working in appropriation, but also sort of building through collage practice this sort of a representation of a queer life that I wanted to see mirrored back at me.
Yeah, I love that the portals became an excuse, like they're an excuse to linger. So I think that's also something that's really interesting about those canvases and all of these works, is there's these multiple registers. I think I actually came to his work accidentally first through porn. And I think, I think so many, so I think we're about like 10 years apart or so. So in 1994, I was a very precocious, like 12-year-old on the internet. Like I was on like CompuServe. I was, and so I think, in this moment, there's like, in the early internet, like early message boards, right? If you're before a world of like Google or like specific ways in which you could search, like gay, like searching for gay as like a adolescent pulled in everything. Like I remember also like, this is how I discovered like Ron Athey's work. This is how I discovered like so many things where, you're looking for gay and you get like someone scanning Calvin Klein ads, someone's like scanning like these like really, really rough scans, of pre-AIDS porn, right? You get like the physique stuff, you get like things, captures from like daytime talk show. It was about how it was used. It wasn't necessarily gay. And then a lot of art slips in. And so I was really interested in like, it wasn't until later going to NYU, it was actually through Matt Wolf, filmmaker. We were at NYU together, and his undergrad thesis was about Wojnarowicz's Archives at Fales. And that's when I realized who Wojnarowicz was. Then I had an author's name to some of the image that I'd been seeing, but I think I was probably at this point where I naively sort of thought that a lot of those concerns were like in the rearview mirror, but I feel like as time goes by, we end up realizing like how much more we are like, you know, I feel like closer and closer and closer to, you know, anyways. But yeah, I feel like this way in which image cruising leads to like memory and these generational things is really interesting, yeah.
I had been making work, when I decided to like, I wasn't gonna take pictures of the world anymore, I was gonna take pictures of pictures. I started working with the magazines around me that I had access to, which were contemporary magazines. And if anyone has any experience looking at gay porn from the 90s, it's terrible. It is terrible because of AIDS, right? It's like, it was overlit, it was super sharp, the bodies were absolutely hairless, and it was to show that this Herculean surface could not be penetrated by disease. It was a safe sexual male body to look at. And for my generation, for sure, there was, you know, many people who felt like that there was this, you know, sexual promiscuity and this explosion of sexual desire that happened in like the late 60s, like we were just cut off from, and we inherited all of this trauma instead. And I think that, you know, and for that reason, we gravitated toward an older aesthetic of pornography because it was sexy, it was hairy, it was dark, it was seedy, it was all of these things that David writes about in his text. And you know, and the MFA thesis work actually was a box of porn that was just delivered to my doorstep by my neighbor, Young Chung. Oh, look, there it is.
Yes.
The box of porn arrived right on cue.
Hold on to your porn. Always hold on to your porn.
And these magazines were, Young Chung, who was my neighbor, dropped them off on my doorstep, and he got them from Dean Samishima, and Dean had got them from Richard Hawkins, and I don't know where Richard Hawkins got them from, but there was like scraps of magazines left that I started building this. This would have been more dramatic if I was reading right now. It's a little weird now, but anyway, but yes, to like find images of desire, like looking at these sort of centerfolds they're all from Blue Boy magazine from circa 1978 to like 1982. But we don't necessarily have to go through. Now it's just a weird big dick on my head.
I love it.
But
yeah, what should we talk about next? I mean, I
Well,
have so
one thing
many
that
ideas.
comes to mind is that when David and I were talking about what book we were going to make for this imprint, that was for Artspace Books, the first edition of this book, it could have been anything, but I was really drawn to the watercolors and to the fact that he had gone to gone to see these movies, and he would look at the guys around him, and then he would go home and, you know, after midnight be like with his watercolor notebook and make, you know, his pictures of what he had seen. And I thought they were so beautiful, but of course he was dying. He was an artist who was becoming known as, you know, the guy who could really chronicle what it was like to have AIDS and to be dying of AIDS. And so we included Spiral, which is the second half of the book, which are these drawings he made in the hospital to kind of occupy himself, and they kind of are dealing with his body as it was deteriorating and dealing with his thoughts at that time. So it was kind of a chronicle of one of his bouts in the hospital. So it was important to me at that time, since it was the first book that we did together, and it was just after Close to the Knives, which was so completely AIDS focused, that people could sort of like appreciate him as an artist who had this range, and if it didn't have AIDS, that he had so much to make. And there were so many ways in which his desire and his sexuality were expressed so incredibly in writing, but also, you know, in these really simple watercolors.
I have questions. I could ask my questions. Something that like you touched on this in your introduction, but I think it's so interesting. Like Amy subletted Tom's apartment, which was the apartment that David had died in, and it was also the apartment that like Peter Hujar had died in. And I think you've all kind of touched on like this legacy and how like the age difference and like seeing his work at different parts of your life. I'm wondering if there's a deeper way to go into legacy and his legacy for your work, and how like your work particularly you think about legacy.
I think that's one that I have not answered yet. I think something kind of what I touched on was a sort of non-linear way in which I encountered the work, but I think, what I was also saying towards the end of like, as time goes by, feeling like more urgency and closer to the work, I think is just living through today. And so I can't say that I've had any specific projects that were like directly informed by them, but I just think about like day to day. Like I was having a conversation with my neighbor Erin. Like we were like, she and I just like talk about our feelings in the world, and I had been flipping through, like I like to keep like several books on my kitchen table, just looking through them, and like, David's work, like the stencils, the globe ones of like, I think those ones are from around like 1990, like, right? And it's like these globes, and it's just like they're spray painted black, but like the stencil of them of the lower 48 is just plastered over the globe. And I was like, he's so like, those should be up right now, right? And so in terms of legacy, it's like my neighbor, she was talking about this anxiety, the world, she's like a young parent, right? And I was like, oh, look at these works. Like, I think there's something in this that can help, put language to these things. And I feel like I'm more in touch with this idea of David's legacy in just being like a friend, a neighbor, like trying to show up and be angry and figure out how to channel it. And the work gives me a place to land and feel like not like alone, because I think the world right now just makes like, I don't know if I could be as brave as he was, but there's like, I'm so thankful to have those as touch points, because the world right now makes us feel like we're completely like gaslit on it, yeah.
I think he has meant different things to me at different times, because like in some of the earlier work that I sort of mentioned, it was definitely an aesthetic. Like I was responding to an aesthetic that was very sort of street, and it was very collage, and it was not David the activist, it was definitely David the artist. And I don't think, like, despite my instructors doing their best, I don't think that from that perspective I could have understood how and inhabited the sort of rage that he felt. And now when I think about him, I hear his voice at a pitch, he's just shouting into a microphone. And it's like, I didn't get that when I was younger, for sure. I was like, I like this sort of aesthetic and the way it was putting together imagery. Now when I think about him, I definitely think about the activist and the activism in his life. And I'm wondering, like, how you parse legacy from legend, because there is also so much of his life that is like so grand and feels so beyond the scope of anything I could imagine someone surviving. And I do think that it's interesting to think about, like, well, not only two things. One is how to be an activist artist now feels very precarious. I don't know how I've not resolved doing both of those things at once, in a work anyway. And I also don't know that even shouting in the street will do much anymore. And this goes like to a pessimistic road of like getting through the everyday, and then also going into your art, your studio, and trying to make work. And those are not separate places. And then also just thinking about like how he posits himself as, like, when he talks about even like a child, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, whatever it is, he talks very casually about like doing sex work, basically. And he's not. He's actually now reverse reading it. It's like, that's called rape. He's not the agent of this decision. He is not a victim either, but he's trying to posit himself somewhere in between that. And it's really complex to read how he talks about it, because he talks about it with such an affect that you want to hold this person now in a way that, like, before having read it, I think I was just like, wow, that's a crazy life. But no, that was an actually lived experience. Is a different thing. I don't know, that was a messy answer.
No, I love that. Do you want to talk about it? No. That brings me, something I was thinking a lot about with him is he brings you close to people, and like in the Waterfront Journals, you're like brought into these people's perspectives that are like, they're just like a normal person, and like closeness to people. I mean, you could probably both talk about like visibility and closeness. I think that could be an open-ended question, but also I think about like the world that he was in is such a different world than the world that we're in now, not just being post-AIDS, but also like we have this like we feel fake closeness to people because everyone has a camera and everyone has access to like putting their image up. And like he lived in a world where like if you were in New York, you wouldn't really know what it was like to be in Ohio. You wouldn't have like visible images of that in a way that we have a fake idea that we do now. And like thinking about what it is to make art now versus then, I don't know. Those are kind of two questions, and if you just want to talk about visibility and closeness, that could be the entrance.
Yeah. I mean, visibility and closeness. The closeness of photography is really interesting and complex. Only because the moment that you like open this thing, you're in like a million different places, and they exist as an image in your mind that has an association and feeling attached to it. And I think I'm actually thinking of like Wojnarowicz's series with Arthur Rimbaud, and like just that stupid paper mask that he puts on. It's not at all convincing, and yet I have a sense of that person in that space cruising New York, and I feel like it is as close as my imagination in a sense, because I embody it a certain kind of way. And I think that this is true when I have relationships, like when I was growing up. I'm thankful that I grew up with magazines. I grew up with paper printed matter. Plug. And if I hadn't had that, I would not be the artist that I am, because all of my work, which I sort of kind of explained, is all cut out paper dolls from magazine sources. So everything's analog. Everything's, that's a cut up standing person, or standing, see, I said person. It's a standing image that I photographed on my bed. And the idea was that this picture could sit up and share space with me. And it was like a resurrection, with an emphasis on erection, that I photographed back into this flat death, this Bartesian flat death. But it's like an intimate portrait with a lover. I shared it. And it existed in my mind and my experience a certain kind of way where it was that close to me. So I don't know if that's sort of an abstract take on that, but that's what I got.
So one of the things I was thinking about, and this is why also I kind of did not get myself together to like put slides, because I kept thinking, I was like, my introduction to so much of his work was through images and image circulation. And so then, but also I'm thinking about how photography, not only it puts us in a million different places, but I feel like for artists who work in interdisciplinary ways, particularly like photography reveals a lot of tensions, it reveals arguments, it reveals collaboration. And so like those like the Rimbaud in New York, they required someone else there to make those images, right? And then you think about like I was thinking about like the Marion Samama images and the Tom Warren collaboration,
The sex series.
Yeah.
Yeah, with those are literal portals of pornography that like through these other images, yeah.
Yeah, and then like but also I was looking through like the Timothy Greenfield Sanders portfolio of just like the art world in the, and all of these ones, like, I feel like they're like, maybe this kind of gets to this visibility, but like, I feel like the photography reveals a kind of like jostling for like, where does this person sit, you know? It's like, you think about like the Tom Warren work, and like that's downtown New York, and then the Timothy Greenfield like, if anyone's familiar with, you know, it's like art stars of the 80s and 90s. It's very, you know, kind of like Leo Castelli world. And I feel like there's something really interesting about how photography always, like, I know there's a kind of collaboration and there's a lot of things behind other works, but photographs I feel like reveal a lot of the tensions there. But yeah, and I think maybe the legacy and legend is then the images become so legendary. And of course there's like the Hujar portraits, right? And I think so many people fall in love with an artist through the images, you know. I think that's why some of them end up in the same gay image board where you're looking for people to get off on, and then you know, you don't realize who this you know. Yeah, photography is weird, and it gets lost, and yeah.
And in another, I were at the time, I think, but in another world we would talk about like the written word versus the photograph, but that's too much. Is there anything, any last thought you want to say, or should we could close?
Does anyone have a question?
Is there any burning questions? One?
Oh, wow.
Okay. Oh. There.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking about my own experience in the 90s and like why David Wojnarowicz was so important to lesbians at that time, and kind of through the writing and like the idea, maybe it was about his personal relationships or the idea of the partnership with Amy as an editor, like that there's something kind of remotely that circulated that kind of hit outside of where you would think. And I don't have a theory about why that is, but I guess it's something that I witnessed at a certain moment. And it happened before the art world kind of worked through its ambivalence about David Wojnarowicz and decided whether it was good or bad art, right? Which took kind of a lot longer. But I guess it's just maybe a question of whether that was built into the work from the beginning, this kind of premise that it might travel to places that you wouldn't expect, that you might find a reader that you wouldn't expect. And if you think that's something about his work, actually.
Should I respond as the lesbian?
I also have a thought, but I'll go after you. Or
thank you for that question. That's really interesting to think about. I mean, for me, I think I responded to him. We became fast friends when we met in the late 80s, and I was living in San Francisco at the time, and he was coming across country. He made those intense, that photograph in the desert in Death Valley where he was buried, and it was around that time. But we were like pen pals. We wrote postcards and letters to each other, and talked on the phone as you used to do. But I always found there was a tenderness about him, and I always found his interest in kind of depicting his own sexuality as something about like this really dear like connection for him. And even though it was so different than, you know, most lesbian sexuality, in that it was like a complete stranger and a different partner every time, there was something that was so deep and personal that he was trying to get to, in like the intimacy of that, which brought up his vulnerability. And I think in that way it seemed so atypical of like gay male art that was like coming out at that time about sex in particular. So I think maybe that was part of its appeal and its kind of like relatability for me.
It's so romantic. I mean, it's not, and it's not like, you know, like romance novel, but it is like the romance of that sort of life.
The moment.
Yes, exactly. and living in that instant and living on the edge of that instant is like something that similar to the section that I read and thinking about the magazines and stuff. It's like it is that sort of push-pull of like danger and like staring into the void and wanting to leap out into it that you sort of feel, that I think is very romantic also. And I have many a lesbian friends, and they are obsessed with gay porn. They really are. I know. This is true. Am I alone?
No, yeah. No, I remember, yeah, the first time some friends mentioned that, they were like, oh yeah, I only watch gay porn. But I will also kind of credit, like, you know, being in New York in the early 2000s, it was mostly through lesbian friends that I feel like kept the dialogue of Wojnarowicz's work happening, because I think, you know, as just like a basic gay guy making mostly kind of gay pictures, I found that the conversation was really shallow. And I really, really depended on more in-depth conversation through queer, lesbian, femme of friends. Because that's where language was. That's where, like, you know, and I think, you know, I think about the, like, practices like Every Ocean Hues and the work that was done, you know, there's this kind of like, you know, there was a way of acknowledging sexuality and desire within community, but also pairing it to language that I think was really important. And yeah, I don't know, just feel like really New York in that way. Gotta have the lesbians, like.
Yeah, totally. And that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry about our tech issues.